is the body of the unit
Yes.
ever entangled?
You mean, can the unit get out of sorts?
Right, so like in that example of the weight, it sounds like having the room to think in its intuitive sense, it's very proactive, but is there ever any situation where the eye can be really quite calm, but the unit otherwise?
Not in my experience. Usually when you get that kind of thing, it's the eye. Although sometimes, if there's a lot of entanglement, like with the two belts, it's kind of hard to tell the eye and the unit apart. And at that point, you may not be able to. So at that point, if you just kind of relax and let things disentangle a little bit, eventually it may become clear who's who and what your next move should be. But I think O Sensei created a rather brilliantly conceived system of training that allows us to look at our situation from almost any perspective and almost any level or scope or magnitude that we might want to. And an example from his own life, I think it was obvious to him as the Second World War was looming in Japan, when the Japanese were feeling pretty strong and really invincible. They had beaten the Russians in a big naval engagement in the Russo-Japanese War around the turn of the 20th century. First time that an Asian power had ever really beaten a Western power in a war. And you got to remember, Japan was a feudal country until about 30 years before they beat the Russians in this big naval engagement. So it was a pretty rapid change. And then we were allies with Japan in World War I. They performed pretty well there. And then in the early stages of World War II, of course, they looked like they were invincible and kind of rolled over everybody. But O Sensei could see it at the time that kind of the war drums were really beating. And he and a friend of his, who was an army officer, actually tried to do some things behind the scenes to head the Second World War off. It had to do with getting Japan a better and more stable supply of oil, which is one of the things they were upset about, that they might not be able to get, because they don't have any domestic oil supply. And so he was determined, along with this friend of his, to try and head at least that excuse for starting the war off. But the government found out about it, and they were unsuccessful in their attempt. But you could see from the kind of stuff he was doing behind the scenes, it was pretty obvious to him that Japan was heading toward a disastrous thing from its own perspective as well as for the rest of the world. And so, again, you can look at things from a very big picture with this kind of practice, as well as kind of the more immediate kind of things you experience with basic Aikido techniques. So it's a map with really an unlimited scope and unlimited opportunities for growth and development, pretty much following the same pattern over and over again. It's just bigger and more inclusive and less entangled as you go along. Another thing about it that I think is really worthy of attention, unlike some other training systems, even in the martial arts, as well as in some systems that involve basically sitting meditation or individual kinds of exercises. In Aikido, it's an art you really cannot do alone. You can do some stuff alone, right? You can swing a sword, stick, whatever. But even there, O Sensei didn't encourage that. People talk about him doing his Misogi Jokata, but there was no Misogi Jokata. He just did a series of movements which were different every time. So the rest of us had to kind of develop some training forms to try and get a foothold in the practice, but he himself was not a fan of katas. So basically it's a practice that you have to do with somebody else, which means you're relating to somebody else. And that puts a whole additional layer of practice in play. And if you think about it from a dojo perspective, it isn't even just that you're interacting with a single person, although that's true most of the time when you're training at a given point in time. But in order to have a dojo that kind of works and functions, there has to be some degree of group harmony and congeniality with the organization falls apart, as we've seen other organizations do. I think both O Sensei's son and his grandson deserve a lot of credit for fundamentally keeping the Aikido world together. And I know that didn't happen by accident, that they were very consciously did certain things and didn't do other things in order to promote that kind of continuing togetherness. So that's sort of the story and the map and kind of how it works and why it's a functional value rather than just an interesting picture of things. Anything before we finish up for today? Yes.
About perhaps I don't have it clear. No, I know I don't have it clear. The manifesting the divine are three dimensions through which coalesce unit of mind can exist.
Correct.
Is there this goal to kind of find a sort of blend of the three, or is divine where O Sensei wished we were always existing?
I would say the overarching one that you're talking about, he called the void, which encompassed all three of them. So you're not exactly blending them, but they're not really separate either. So what we're doing when we try to focus on one, manifest, hidden, or divine, is sort of a convention of training. But it's designed to help us avoid entanglement and kind of get a clear picture of what each of these aspects of ourselves are. It's kind of like if we focused on our right arm for a while. Well, I know it's still connected to my body, but the right arm does certain things, the left arm does certain things. So it's a way of sort of piecemealing to start with a sense of the creation. And then the three begin to overlap. It's speculation on my part, but I think probably one of the reasons he was so good as a martial artist, could do the things he could do, is he found some way to really let these overlay each other on a kind of a functional and operational basis that nobody else in Aikido, at least yet, has quite been able to do. And that's why he could do what he could do. So, does it help a little bit?
Yes.
Richard, did you have something?
Yeah, many things, but I'm trying to stay with the image of that maybe that cutting board or that table you mentioned with the dough on it, and it's interesting too that the words go, you know, cross-culturally, fullness of the dough, you know, the dough, and then you have the fullness of the dough, but being able to take a cookie cutter or being able to take a small piece and work with that and get clear on that, kind of get the edges and get that kind of be with that,
Right.
and then kind of be able to step back and go, yep, and look, I've got this, the rest of this to parse out and to work with and to be with, and it just seems it's a comforting, nice picture. I appreciate the metaphor very much because it helps me when my mind wants to get entangled about it.
I think it took, well, I know it took me about a year before I knew what that was, or I felt it. And I think it's one of the keys is you feel it. It's like conceptually, it's like, oh, it's this thing that your spirit does, you know. But it's when I started feeling it, and that's when it started all kind of making sense of it. And the
Right.
connection with like my body and, I do this and then I kind of feel that. And so it took a long time, even just to feel that. I remember coming to class when I was a white belt and going, what the heck, And, some people get it a lot quicker,
Some people do, but you read interviews even with some of O Sensei's close students, and some of them were still scratching their heads. So a year is not bad.
Well, and you know, the divine and the hidden, I mean, those were long journeys too, just to, but again, it was a feel thing, it wasn't
Exactly.
a concept thing, it was like, oh, okay.
The concept itself is of relatively little value by itself. If you could blend it with the experience, then you're both having the experience and you have kind of an understanding of what it is you're experiencing. Then the two come together nicely. But you're right, as a concept, by itself, it doesn't offer much.
Yeah, like the body, you know, when we were doing the mirroring the body life, that exercise, I mean, that was kind of nowhere with that until I actually kind of felt it when I was training with you, and you're like, you know, that was it, and I was like, oh yeah, you know, so just kind of, just from that moment, it was like, oh, like a physical, I can feel it.
Right.
And then after that, it just kind of makes a lot of sense.
That's
You know,
right.
it's
Yeah.
the tangible thing.
Yeah. That's kind of what I was getting at when I said O Sensei had a deep understanding of how the universe worked, but then he embodied it. And the embodiment was a big deal. So without that, you know, he might have been a famous philosopher or something, you know, who knows why. But he didn't go down that road.
And we get to throw people.
That's right. That's right.
You have the unit side and you have the I side.
That's right.
And then you have entanglement that's sort of seemingly inherent almost.
Right.
And if you're looking at the I side and you're solving it by, quote, being easy on the I,
Right.
as a phrase, how would you say for the unit side, what do you do if you see that the entanglement is there?
Well, the unit has the relatively easy capacity to grow and develop if it's not being inhibited by the I.
Okay.
I'll give you an example.